For the first time in my life, I realized that there was something more important to me than God, and that was truth. And for the first time in my life, I learned that if I had to choose between God and truth, I would choose truth. Before, I had placed God and truth on the same level, as if they were equals. But I now began to realize that truth was necessarily a greater good than God, because it was possible for God not to exist, but it was not possible for truth not to exist. And this made truth God's master and ultimate judge. The state of the truth determined whether God even existed. If God's existence did not match the state of truth, then the entire concept of God was worthless. It would simply fall into the graveyard of false ideas. The truth itself would carry on. Truth did not need God to function. Its potential to transform and shape the world held its own power. But what was the truth about God? Theism defines God as both the creator of the universe and an intervening force in that universe. It also defines God as personal, meaning that God is a person, a being, separate from the universe He created. Having faced my fear of losing God and survived it, I allowed myself, for the first time in my life, to really look at the concept and ask, is this true? Do I really believe this? Given what I know about the world and this definition of God, does this even make sense? And the answer was a resounding no. It didn't. For one, if this being were roaming around the universe, breaking its natural laws, then why did it create those laws in the first place? Further, there just seemed to be no room for this being in existence. Every job that this being was supposed to do appeared to already be fulfilled by some fully explainable natural process. Every step science took forward seemed to leave less and less room for this invasive supernatural being. And this didn't only apply to science, it applied to my everyday life. In order to connect with this supernatural being, I had to actively disconnect from the natural world around me, which, ironically, was the only existence I could verify with my own eyes. This is what it meant for me as a theistic Christian to be holy, to not be of the flesh, to not be worldly. It meant disconnecting from the world, and ultimately, I now felt, disconnecting from reality. It had made me feel psychologically unhealthy, and I now realized it had probably contributed to my recent failure in statistics. This was because instead of studying the book in front of me, or asking someone else for help, I disconnected myself from the natural world that books and people existed in order to seek help from a supernatural being. And so, I concluded, I did not believe in this theistic supernatural being anymore. But when I thought about it, there was another way that I had interacted with what I had called God that did not involve disconnecting with reality through rituals like prayer. In fact, in this second way of interacting with God, I fully embraced reality. I embraced every heartbeat, every glance into the eyes of another person, every breath, every thought, and every ray of sunlight. And when I saw these things, I felt like I was literally seeing God face to face. Not a creation of God, not a symbol of God, but the ineffable reality of God itself. This was what I felt was meant by the verse, God is love. This God was not only compatible with the natural world, this God was nature itself. This God was the ultimate form of unity. It was literally everything. This God was not a being. This God was beyond being. This was a God I could believe in. I didn't know it at the time, but this conception of God is called pantheism. Formally, pantheism is the belief that God is the transcendent reality of which the material universe and human beings are a part. I perceive this God in the form of interactions between the natural world and human psychology as the true source of my numinous experiences. In fact, the more I contrasted this God with the God of theism, the more I despised theism for preventing me from seeing this greater form of God. After conceptually separating the theistic Christian God away from this new and more pure form of God, I was able to see how ugly it was. This theistic God was a dark force that demanded to be glorified. It demanded its will with an ironclad fist. It had been built and fed over the years by the Christian imagination. They heaped their greatest fears and most bigoted opinions upon it until it took on a life of its own. This God sent homosexuals to hell because it detested their actions. You are not worthy of him. Your understanding is inferior and your logic is flawed. So he is your only redemption. And you damn well better believe every word in the Bible, whether you like it or not, because those words are his. If you didn't, he would fan the flames of hell in preparation for you. He had given you a chance. He had stated very clearly that Jesus was the only way, but you wouldn't listen. His will was divine. His guidance was perfect and perfectly clear. If you didn't know his guidance, it was your fault. You had to fix your sinful life. You had to separate yourself from the world through prayer and beg for forgiveness of that sin, because you are pitiful and so unworthy and so lost without him. And it was in this God that I saw the last bastion of hell. It became my mission to rid it from humanity. I realized that I had given it life. It had been like a program running in the background of my mind. I had fed and animated this God throughout my entire life. It had no reality of its own, only what I gave it. It was truly nothing, and as soon as I cut off its supply, it began to die. It was me. I had been expressing what I imagined to be the divine will. I had been emulating God. Now I wish I could tell you that after making this fairly lucid observation about the traditional theistic Christian concept of God, that I moved on rationally from there to greater purposes and higher forms of learning. But that would not be the truth, because that is not what happened, at least not initially. I was convinced that this God was Satan, and that Satan was nothing, literally nothing, completely insubstantial, able to create nothing on its own, or even to exist on its own. And this false God had clothed itself in the majesty of the real God, and if I had the power to stop it, then that made me Jesus. That's right. For 4 very interesting days, I thought I was literally the second coming of Jesus Christ. I began to reinterpret Revelation, which I apparently still felt had some kind of authority, despite the fact that I no longer believed the Bible was completely true. The beast was the God of the Old Testament, the theistic God in its most terrible form. The false prophet had been Moses. People had mistaken Revelation completely. Our actual spot in the prophecy was near the end. The devil was ready to be chained and banished. His manifestation as the theistic God ready to be unveiled, revealing his true insubstantiality, his ultimate nothingness, at which point he would fade from existence, removing the barrier between humanity and the transcendent reality of heaven, which existed fully in the natural world. And the man riding on the horse, the one whose name was known only to himself, that was me. I would never tell a soul of my identity. I would only guide humanity past the barrier in our transcendence and allow heaven to be my guide. Eventually, I emailed the professor about some of my ideas. I never told him that I thought I was the Messiah, but apparently he was able to infer it from the type of language I was using. In response, he gave me a long list of people over the centuries who, just like me, had thought they were the second coming of Jesus Christ. The length of this list, and the similarity of their ideas and plans to my own, sobered me very quickly. So, I probably wasn't the incarnation of Jesus Christ. In my defense, this all happened almost immediately after my deconversion, which itself occurred in a jarringly brief amount of time, so maybe some insanity was unavoidable. But after moving past that deeply embarrassing detour from rational thinking, I was still very compelled by my new vision of a non-theistic God. Ironically, my first steps out of theism were my first steps into theology and a deeper search for the true nature of God. For several months after my deconversion, I considered myself neither atheist nor theist. This is because, at that time, I presumed that the definition of theism was belief in God, and that correspondingly, atheism was a lack of belief in God. And those stances made no sense unless you first defined what you meant by the word God. Of course, if one meant an invasive supernatural being, then I was an atheist. However, it was also possible to assign the word God to things that obviously existed, such as the entirety of the universe itself, or the creative forces of the universe, where creative force meant everything from stellar nucleosynthesis to human engineering. In respect to these definitions of God, I was a theist. To say that one was an atheist towards these definitions would be patently absurd. It would be tantamount to saying that you did not believe in the entirety of the universe, or that you did not believe in stellar nucleosynthesis and human engineering. And so I continued with this philosophical stance for a long time, determined to point out to both self-proclaimed atheists and self-proclaimed theists how absurd their position was if they didn't first define their use of the word God. Two people arguing about the existence or non-existence of God were clearly wasting their breath if they didn't first define what they meant by God. However, eventually I ran across the proper definition of theism, and realized that atheism was an intuitive negation of theism. So people who were not theists were atheists. These definitions fit the most common debates I saw on the internet as well, where on one side of the debate there was a Christian theist arguing for the existence of an invasive supernatural being, and on the other there was an atheist arguing that the Christian's arguments were inadequate for establishing that being's existence. And so, by this definition, I was an atheist. It was a strange, liberating, and slightly amusing experience to realize this. I was an atheist. After all these years of thinking that atheists were cynical, nihilistic, and negative people, I realized that I myself was an atheist. I was an atheist. I repeated the proposition over and over in my mind as I walked through the grocery store on this day of realization. I am an atheist. I am an atheist. Of all people, I, the otherwise lifelong Christian and relentlessly positive person, am an atheist. This realization blew my mind. At the time, I had never met an atheist who took the same approach to conversation that I did. Even the professor, who was still a very kind person and relentlessly patient overall, was very rough around the edges compared to me. One thing I had noticed about many atheists I had met as atheists, the professor included, was their tendency to commit the appeal to ridicule fallacy. Some atheists I met seemed to do this compulsively, rejecting claims purely on the grounds that they sounded unusual or contrary to common sense. However, I had learned through several examples in my ethics class that common sense, which is usually just an appeal to popular opinion, is not a sound basis for argument. One such example my ethics professor used was the case of Stella Liebeck, who had sued McDonald's because she had burned herself with their coffee. Even bringing this example up elicited jeers from the class about how sue-happy some Americans were, and how ridiculous it was that she would sue over burning herself with coffee. That was, until the ethics professor revealed that, at that time, McDonald's required franchises to serve coffee at 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and that the woman had suffered burns to her thighs, buttocks, and genitals that had required 8 days of skin grafting and 2 years of medical treatment. After the professor revealed these facts, the class sat in a solemn and humbled silence. I personally was shocked at how skewed my perspective of the situation had been before I'd gathered all the necessary facts to truly understand it. This example revealed to me that sometimes, when we casually appealed to common sense, we had the frightening potential to be not only ignorantly uninformed, but also blunderingly cruel to the very people that we would be defending if we had instead withheld judgment before gathering all the facts. As the ethics professor had shown, the problem with common sense, with its knee-jerk criticisms of the unfamiliar, is that it is too uninformed to be reliable. Getting to the heart of unusual claims requires real investigation, and I had seen many atheists compulsively reject religious claims purely on the grounds that they were unusual. To be fair, I had also seen many theists compulsively reject evolution and compulsively accept the validity of religious experiences for the same common sense-based reasons. Over time, though, I did meet atheists with the same approach to conversation as me, people who took great pains to be calm, diplomatic, and fair. I slowly began to realize that I was far from alone in this gentler type of atheism. I slowly discovered that these more soft-spoken atheists were everywhere, and were often quiet people who I had never imagined were atheists and had always assumed were Christian. And something else I realized over time was that even most of the louder atheists had a soft spot when you spoke to them in private. And most of the time they were rude not out of sheer spite, but because of their frustration at having experienced repeated encounters with the logical fallacies that permeated most religious thinking, and their resentment towards the negative impacts that religion had had on society. One stance I grappled with briefly was agnosticism. The stance of agnosticism most commonly means the belief that we don't have enough evidence to know for certain whether or not God exists. This stance seems to have arisen primarily from a mistaken belief that most non-atheists have about atheists, and that is the belief that most atheists are strong atheists, which means the belief that the theistic God does not exist. At first glance, this may seem identical to the definition of atheism I used earlier, which can be restated as a lack of belief in the theistic God, but it is actually very different. In order for one to state God does not exist, they would have to know everything about the universe, and they would have to know that our universe does not contain a God. As the agnostic rightly points out, this is not humanly possible. We are limited beings, and our knowledge and perception are limited to an infinitesimally smaller scale than the entire universe. However, I have never met an atheist who, when pressed, identified as a strong atheist. Rather, every atheist I have ever seen address this issue identifies themselves by the definition I have been using, which is simply a lack of belief in God, which means that these atheists are not claiming to know that God doesn't exist. They aren't even claiming to have good evidence that God doesn't exist. Rather, they are simply not persuaded by the arguments that theists have presented. They simply have not encountered good enough evidence to persuade them. Atheists in this category can most unambiguously be identified as agnostic atheists, which means they are atheistic because they do not have a belief in the existence of a supernatural being, and they are agnostic because they do not claim to know that that supernatural being does not exist. So, in my experience, basically all atheists are agnostics, and most agnostics are also atheists since they almost never have a positive belief in God. As a theist, I saw the stance of agnosticism as giving a concession to theism, meaning that since agnostics are not claiming to know that the God of theism does not exist, that they think people are logically justified to believe in him, despite not having solid evidence for him. This is not the case. My own agnostic stance is that, without evidence, people are no more justified to believe in the theistic God than they would be to believe in ghosts, psychics, leprechauns, UFOs, fairies, polytheistic gods, or reincarnation without solid evidence. For the same reasons that we must be agnostic to the existence of the theistic God, we must also be agnostic to the existence of all these things. Agnosticism gives the God of theism no more grounds for existing than it does any of these other concepts and beings. So at this point in my journey, I had established two hypotheses. One was that theists had used bad arguments to attempt to establish the existence of the theistic God. This made me an agnostic atheist. The other was that a concept of God as something greater than ourselves could still be spoken of meaningfully in some form of non-theistic God. At this point I was a pantheist, but more generally I was a non-theist, which is a term that people with this stance towards God language sometimes use to refer to themselves. As I continued my journey, I pursued both of these hypotheses in parallel. when I had described to the professor how I felt about my fellow Christians, he responded with the comment, "Have you read Jonathan Livingston Seagull? You are describing circling above the flock." I told him I hadn't, but ordered the book on Amazon. I was eager to read any book that could help me understand my new identity and direction in life. When the book arrived and I started reading it, I was a little perplexed, because it was literally about a seagull. It read like a children's book about seagulls, but like being good, there was much more to this book than its title implied. As I trudged through the book's seemingly banal and uninteresting beginning, a hint of its allegory crept into my mind. As I kept reading, suddenly the book exploded into a vibrant allegorical painting whose richness overwhelmed me. I had never read a story that was so symbolic and felt so deeply relevant to my own identity. As I read the story, my mind mapped my own experiences and the entities from my own life to the story's symbols. The flock was the people of the church. Flying was the art and practice of learning and seeking the truth, no matter where it led you. It was something that I felt the people of the church did only on Sundays, and even then only minimally. Feeding was the act of milling around in life and trying to make a living. It was, ironically, what I felt the people of the church spent most of their time on. Their work, their play, and their repeated recitation and rereading of Iron Age dogmas were all almost entirely mindless activities. None of these activities challenged them or taught them anything new. From interacting with them in Sunday school, it seemed like their mental lives were like a dead sea of old ideas that stagnated and mixed together, but very rarely made contact with fresh water. Jonathan had discovered the joy of flying, the joy of learning and flourishing in new ideas and new information, the joy of seeking the truth fully and unabashedly, and when he tried to share this joy with the flock, they banished him. And as I read this passage, I feared that I would suffer the same fate if I tried to share my own insights with the church. Because as you may be surprised to discover, I was still a member of the church, and the church was still the only organization through which I felt I could dependably further my philosophical identity and the philosophical identities of other people, despite being an atheist. My only confidant in this largely Christian landscape was a man who lived hundreds of miles away. I felt like an infiltrator in the church, but they were completely unable to recognize any change in my spiritual identity, despite praying, singing, and speaking with me at length. This was further evidence to me that they were not guided by an omniscient supernatural deity, despite fully believing and proclaiming that they were. No one treated me any differently, and people were still very receptive to my philosophical insights, despite the fact that I knew all of these insights came from a completely atheistic perspective. But just like Jonathan Seagull, I feared that if I shared my full perspective, only social exile and mass misunderstanding awaited me. As for my own theological journey, an idea from Jonathan Livingston Seagull that stood out to me was that we are all ideas in the mind of the great goal, or, in other words, that we are all a part of the mind of God. This theological idea is basically a type of panentheism, which can be defined as the belief that all is contained within God. It's compatible with pantheism because it states that everything is God. But in addition to stating that, it also states that everything is contained within God. One reason I found this theology compelling was because of a book I'd read as a soon-to-be graduate student in artificial intelligence called Swarm Intelligence. This book made the argument that intelligence is only meaningful as a social process between multiple entities. It also argued that intelligence is not limited to biological creatures. From these premises, I extrapolated that the universe itself could possibly be thought of as a type of mind. I gained further support for this theology through the book The Hidden Face of God by Gerald Schroeder, which I read despite the fact that, and probably because I felt the book was something the professor would probably disagree with, I wanted to be sure I wasn't walking down my new path blindly. And Schroeder's previous book had been so compelling to me that I thought this new book could lend new insights and maybe provide answers to some of the problems that the professor had pointed out. Throughout the book, Schroeder walks through many elaborate biological systems in our bodies to illustrate its illustrious inner workings. He argues that such wisdom in biological engineering cannot be explained by gradual evolution due to the lack of transitional fossils and the improbability of random mutations creating the right changes for such wisdom to manifest. Several years later, I discovered why these are fallacious criticisms of gradual evolution, but at this time, I found them quite compelling. Ultimately, Schroeder argues that, due to the deficiencies of gradual evolution, in order for life to have such wisdom in its design, some kind of wisdom must pervade the universe itself. This theological idea is a specific type of panentheism called panpsychism, which can be defined as the belief that everything material, however small, has an element of consciousness. In other words, Schroeder's argument is that the universe itself is conscious. He further bolsters this argument with some interpretations of quantum mechanics that I also discovered were fallacious several years later, but that I also found compelling at the time. In addition to espousing panpsychism, Schroeder also argues for deism in the form of a metaphysical non-thing which must have preceded the physical world. Deism can be defined as the belief in a creator of the universe that does not intervene in the universe after creating it. His argument begins by asserting that, before the Big Bang, time and space did not exist. So whatever spawned the Big Bang must have itself been outside of time and space, and must have therefore been non-physical, and must have therefore been metaphysical. Like his other arguments, I learned several years later that this argument too was fallacious. But also like his other arguments, I found it compelling at the time. As I continued these studies in theology, I began to notice two problems with the stances I was taking. One was that sometimes these stances contradicted each other. For example, deism was not readily compatible with panpsychism, because deism implied the creator did not intervene in the physical world, and panpsychism implied that the entire physical world was currently guided by a universal consciousness. I remedied this conflict by accepting that all of these positions were just hypotheses, and perhaps many, or only one, or possibly none of them were correct. I had learned my lesson with theism, and I did not cling to any one of these hypotheses too strongly. The only unwavering commitment I held now was to finding the truth, no matter what it was. The other problem with some of these beliefs, especially deism and panpsychism, is that sometimes they blurred into theism by asserting or implying that the creator or the universe itself was intelligent. I remedied this conflict by accepting that my atheism itself was, at least at this time, fuzzy, in that I still strongly entertained the possibility of an intelligence that either preceded or pervaded the entire universe. Having satisfied myself that I had taken the time to appreciate more arguments for theology, and even the possibility of a more advanced form of theism, I focused my studies once more on reading the books meant to dismantle the arguments for conventional Christian theism. Because I was still a poor college student, I checked out most of the books that the professor recommended from the library. To my surprise, when I looked for a copy of Some Mistakes of Moses in KU's gigantic humanities-focused Watson library, I couldn't find it. The only place it showed up was the Spencer Research Library, a library I'd never heard of and had never been to. When I arrived at Spencer Library, it was, unlike Watson, completely empty of visitors other than myself. At the end of a long vacant lobby, a woman sat at a desk to receive visitors. After having me fill out a card with the catalog number of Some Mistakes of Moses, she told me to have a seat in the reading room and that the librarian would bring it to me. After about 5 minutes, a tall, kindly man in his 60s arrived with my book and gently set it down on the reading stand in front of me. To my surprise, the book looked ancient. As I turned its brittle pages, I realized why I had had to come to the Spencer Research Library to read it. The book had been published in 1898, over 100 years ago. Robert Greene Ingersoll was born in 1833 and died in 1899. He was a talented American orator whose speeches were attended and exuberantly appreciated by literary giants such as Walt Whitman and Mark Twain. His speeches were an influential catalyst for the golden age of free thought, which lasted from 1856 until the early 1900s. Despite his cognitive and linguistic assets as a leader, his radical views against religion and slavery and for the rights of women effectively prevented him from holding a public office higher than Attorney General. As I opened the book and began reading, I was overwhelmed and surprised by its positive and ambitious aspirations.
I want to do what little I can to make my country truly free, to broaden the intellectual horizon of our people, to destroy the prejudices of ignorance and fear, to do away with the blind worship of the ignoble past, with the idea that all the good and great are dead, and that the living are totally depraved, that all pleasures are sins, that sighs and groans are alone pleasing to God, that thought is dangerous, that intellectual courage is a crime, that cowardice is a virtue, that a certain belief is necessary to secure salvation.
This statement was one of the first of many passionate and inspiring arguments I encountered for the intellectual freedom and goodwill offered by the ideas underpinning agnostic atheism. As I read on, I saw that Ingersoll also wanted clergy to be able to think freely and not be constrained by their congregations.
I am a great friend to the clergy, in spite of all they may say against me. I am going to do them a great and lasting service. The pulpit should not be a pillory.
Much of the book contained intuitive observations about the absurdities in the Bible that often go unquestioned and unaddressed by Christians. One such absurdity that particularly bothered Ingersoll was the idea that God himself regularly created something out of nothing, which revealed a hypocrisy in Christian apologetics, since Christians so often criticize atheists for claiming something came from nothing. Another passionate criticism Ingersoll had of Christian culture was the idea that a single belief would be the difference between a person's salvation or damnation. He illustrated the absurdity of this idea with a commentary on Genesis that he called the rib story, where God created Eve since Adam could find no helper among the animals that he could appreciate.
And finding that Adam was so particular, God had to make him a helper. And having used up all the nothing, he was compelled to take part of a man to make the woman with. And he took from the man a rib. Now we can imagine God with a bone in his hand, and about to start a woman, trying to make up his mind whether it should be a blonde or a brunette. Right here, it is only proper that I should warn you of the consequences of laughing at any story in the Holy Bible. When you come to die, your laughing at this story will be a thorn in your pillow. As you look back on the record of your life, no matter how many men you have wrecked and ruined, and no matter how many women you have deceived and deserted, all that may be forgiven you. But if you recollect that you laughed at God's book, you will see through the shadows of death the leering looks of fiends and forked tongues of devils. Let me show you how it will be. For instance, let's say it is the day of judgment. When a man is called up by the recording secretary, or whoever does the cross-examining, he says to his soul, "Where are you from?" "I'm from the world." "What kind of man were you?" "Well, I was a good fellow. I loved my wife. I loved my children. My home was my heaven. My fireside was my paradise. To sit there and see the lights and shadows falling on the faces of those I love, that to me was a perpetual joy. I never gave them one solitary moment of pain. I don't owe $1 in the world. And I left enough to pay my funeral expenses and take care of the ones I loved. That is what kind of man I was. Did you belong to a church? I did not. They were too narrow for me. They were always expecting to be happy simply because somebody else was being damned. Did you believe the rib story? What rib story? Oh, do you mean that Adam and Eve business? No, I did not. To tell you the God's truth, that was a little more than I could swallow. To hell with him! Next! Where do you come from? I'm from the world too. Do you belong to any church? Yes, sir, and to the Young Men's Christian Association. What is your business? Cashier in a bank. Did you ever run off with any of the money? I don't like to tell. Well, you have to. Yes, sir, I did. How much did you run off with? $100,000. Did you take anything else with you? Yes, sir. I took my neighbor's wife. Did you have a wife and children of your own? Yes, sir. And you deserted them? Oh, yes. But such was my confidence in God that I believed He would take care of them. Have you heard from them since? No, sir. Did you believe the rib story? Ah, bless your soul, yes, I believed it all, sir. I often used to be sorry that there were no harder stories to believe in the Bible, so that I could show what my faith could do. You believed it, did you? Yes, with all my heart. Give this man a harp. I simply wanted to show you how important it is to believe these stories. Of all the authors in the world, God hates critics the most.
Sitting alone in the research library's reading room, I found myself trying to hold back uncontrollable laughter. This was the most compelling criticism of salvation by belief I had ever encountered. These were all ideas I had considered briefly and vaguely as a Christian. But Ingersoll drove these premises of faith to such an extreme, yet undeniable logical conclusion that I could not deny their absurdity. His argument clearly illustrated how salvation by belief alone was contradictory with the idea that God was a just and reasonable being. This type of argument is called reductio ad absurdum, and it is a commonly employed and powerful type of philosophical argumentation. Its successful employment underpins the powerful arguments in many of the videos of such YouTube comedy giants as Dark Matter 2525 and Non-Stamp Collector. One of the keys to making it philosophically valid is that one must present their opponent's arguments realistically and precisely before showing why they are absurd. Failing to represent an opponent's position accurately and fairly before criticizing it produces a straw man and a subsequent appeal to ridicule. Ingersoll was the first atheist I personally had encountered who employed reductio ad absurdum correctly. On the other hand, I was starting to realize that my own closed-mindedness as a Christian had kept me from fully considering arguments like the one Ingersoll was presenting. Now that I no longer filtered my thoughts and perceptions, I was finding that I could think sharper and faster. My mind was changing, and I was starting to mature and improve my thinking in a practical way that I hadn't even realized I was missing out on before losing my faith. As I handed Some Mistakes of Moses back to the librarian, he said, "That is a very important book. Too many people have forgotten about it." My next book was Who Wrote the New Testament by Burton Mack, which I was able to find by myself at Watson Library. One thing that surprised me while searching for the book was just how many academic books there were analyzing the Bible and criticizing the traditional Christian perspective of it. Mack's most compelling insight for me was that today's Orthodox Christianity was just one of the many Jesus movements that existed in early Christianity. The only reason Christians believe what they do today was because the other Jesus movements had been suppressed by the now Orthodox Christianity as heretics. One can imagine a similar occurrence in a hypothetical future America where Mormonism has become the Orthodox version of Christianity, and Baptists and Pentecostals are referred to as the heretics of the past. The next book on my list was by someone considered a modern Christian heretic, the Anglican bishop John Shelby Spong of the Diocese of Newark. With a provocative title like Why Christianity Must Change or Die, I expected Spong's book to be a scathing, complaining polemic against what modern Christianity had become. Also, given that Spong was still a bishop in the church and probably wanted Christianity to change rather than die, I suspected he was probably just complaining about the conservative values in Christianity, such as the prohibition of gay marriage, and probably just wanted the church to have more liberal values. I found such a message common and uninteresting, and was skeptical about how much philosophical value the book would have. To my surprise, the book was neither a polemic nor a weak appeal to tolerance. It was nothing less than an attempt to rescue Christianity by reshaping its most fundamental philosophical assumptions from the ground up. Spong's radical proposal was that we needed to reform Christianity to exist without the theistic God. The man was a living paradox. He considered himself both a passionate non-theist and a committed Christian. Spong considered himself a believer in exile. He had been trapped in the paradoxical position of no longer believing that the theistic God could exist, yet still believing that there was something profound about the experience of Christ. He was at a crossroads. He could no longer believe in Christianity as it had been traditionally expressed, yet he wanted what he felt to be the essence of Christianity to survive. He had encountered many modern Christians who had found themselves in the same situation as he. Indeed, I too found this book compelling because I was not ready to give up on Christianity completely either. There was a reason I still went to church. It was because I was convinced that even if the theistic God did not exist, there was something special about Christianity and the Christian experience. Spong compared our current exile as believers to the Babylonian exile experienced by the Hebrews, where their temple was destroyed and Judah was overtaken by Babylon. Before this time, it was believed that the only place that God resided was in the temple in Jerusalem, and the only place the laws of the Torah could be practiced was in Judah. They believed the city of Jerusalem was supernaturally protected by God. Yet, against all their confident predictions and proclamations, the city had been destroyed. What followed was the exile. The image of God they knew, the God who lived in their temple and protected their city, had been destroyed. This God either had to grow or die. And now, Spong contended, due to the relentless march of human knowledge and awareness, the God we once knew had died as well. And as seekers of truth, we had to embrace that death. Any God who can be killed ought to be killed. As a growing human society, we saw the death of this God coming, slowly but surely. Ironically, much of this march to execution had been carried out by the very people who admired and loved this idea of God. Believing they were discovering His laws and purpose for the universe, they began intensely investigating the natural world. Our view of the natural world, the view espoused by Christian scripture, began in 3 tiers. The earth was flat, and the earth was where we lived. Beneath the earth was hell. Above the earth was the sky, and above the sky was heaven, where our holy God lived and ruled over human life. This is the world where Jesus ascended to the sky to return to God after His death. This was the world where a light from heaven surrounded Saul. Yet these world images of Hebrew and Christian scripture began to falter as the arguments and evidence supporting the idea of a round earth slowly spread from ancient Greek culture to the rest of the world. They faltered further still when Copernicus and Galileo supported and promoted the idea that the earth was not the center of the universe. The picture expanded larger still when we discovered that we lived in an expansive, enormous universe, more than 93 billion light-years in diameter. The impact of these seemingly innocuous observations on the Christian understanding of Scripture is profound. It's one thing to imagine Jesus ascending into the sky above. It is quite another to imagine Jesus rocketing off into space in some odd direction. Where is Jesus going exactly in this new universe? Is He floating around in space? Is He zipping around faster than the speed of light? Is He trying to reach the edge of the universe, or will He stop off at a black hole? Or will He just fade back into another dimension since no one on Earth can see Him anymore? If that's the case, was it all just a show? Where in the hell is Jesus going exactly when He goes up in a universe like this? What does ascending to heaven even mean in a universe like this? It doesn't make any sense. Unconsciously and insidiously, a part of our perception of the theistic God had been irrevocably destroyed. It makes no sense to have a Father watching down from heaven when heaven is just the light from a star shining through a cloud formation between us and 46 billion light-years of mostly empty space. Looking up into the heavens doesn't make any sense when you know what is behind the clouds. For a while yet, though, humanity could still take comfort in the fact that the theistic God was still in control of the universe. That was until scientists like Isaac Newton began to discover natural laws that revealed our universe to be predictable and deterministic. Everything we had attributed to God, from plagues to storms to healing, began to be revealed as cogs in a deterministic machine that required no God to work. At least, though, we could count on the fact that God had created us to live in this deterministic world of laws that He surely created. Creation was one act we could count on. Surely we had been created in the image of God. Yet Charles Darwin opened our eyes to a reality where we had evolved and were still evolving. Creations we did not appear to be. Rather, we appeared to be processes that rose from the clashing deterministic order and chaos of the universe. As we grasp for ways to resuscitate a dying God, we reach for quantum mechanics. Its new and tantalizing opposition to determinism seemed to create a hole through which the supernatural could re-invade our lives. Yet, the study of quantum mechanics has never borne such fruit. It has revealed nothing more than yet another strange and alienating realm with its own cold principles that had nothing to do with our warm and loving image of God. To anyone with the education to grasp our current understanding of the natural world, the God of theism had become unemployed. The tasks assigned to this God by traditional wisdom had slowly but surely been stripped from the divine side. This God no longer had any real work to do. Every job this God was supposed to do had been replaced by something else. And as we reflected on where this God came from and why we had believed in him at all, in that reflection, we saw ourselves. The God of Thomas Aquinas looked and acted very much like Thomas Aquinas. So too did the God of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Thomas Cranmer look and act like each of these theologians. As we reflected, we began to see, according to Spong, how we had created God in our own image. The attributes we have claimed for God are nothing but human qualities expanded beyond human limits. Human life is mortal. God is immortal. Human life is finite. God is infinite. Human life is limited in power. God is omnipotent. Human life is limited in knowledge. God is omniscient. Human life is bound to a particular space. God is omnipresent. Human life is bound by natural laws. God is supernatural. Reading Spong, I could see how the creation process for these ideas was so obvious it was childish. All we had to do was look at ourselves and see what we were not, then imagine a being that was what we were not. We had imagined a perfect human being to be in charge of this world and this universe. This image was so narcissistic. We could not handle a world where something like a human was not in charge. We could not handle a universe that was not ruled by something like us. In worshiping this image of God, we worshipped ourselves. We worshipped the idea of something like a human controlling our destiny, just as we exercise control on the world around us. Spong had also revealed to me an ecclesiastical world that I never knew existed before. It was a world where priests and bishops who examined their faith realized its inadequacy, where pastors and nuns lived a life in secret where they doubted the very words they preached. How many church leaders in my life had secretly doubted the very existence of God? My eyes had suddenly been opened to the possibility. If I had discovered the problems with my faith through reflection and study, why wouldn't many clergy members? It made so much sense now, and it filled me with hope. What was most fascinating about Spong was that, instead of abandoning Christianity to theism, he was trying to rescue Christianity from it. Despite the fact that theism was clearly inadequate, he emphasized that he still felt the Christian experience was profound and useful. He argued that there was no reason to allow the current images of Christ, which had been fully authored in creeds from the 5th century, to dictate how we interpreted the Christ experience in the modern age. There was no reason to think that the people on these councils 1500 years ago had any more authority to dictate what Christ meant to us than we did. Spong made his argument for a new image of Jesus based on the earliest Christian scriptures, the letters of the Apostle Paul, starting with the earliest Pauline letter, 1 Thessalonians. I was very surprised to learn that these were the earliest Christian scriptures, but it made sense. Paul never spoke of anything in the Gospels except for Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. He never showed any awareness of any of the extravagant stories and miracles. These stories in the Gospels seem to have been extrapolated and invented from the ideas of Paul himself. From Mark to Matthew to Luke, the supernatural claims got bigger and bigger. Like a big fish story, the fish got bigger with every telling. But Paul's own image of Jesus, the first image of Jesus, was much more modest, realistic, and focused. Spong argued that Paul and the other early Christians had encountered something in the Christ experience that changed them. The story of Christ was someone who lived fully and loved wastefully, who expanded beyond the provincial limits of his society. He broke barriers that, for their culture, had never been broken before. He accepted children, Gentiles, criminals, and tax collectors. Christ had expanded the boundaries of their compassion and fullness of life in a way that they had never experienced before. And this expansion of compassion and fullness was real, even if the language of theism early Christians used to explain it was not. And I could admire this about Spong's perspective on Jesus. After encountering people like Robert Ingersoll, the professor, and even Spong himself, I was no longer convinced that Jesus was the pinnacle of human existence. These people had revealed things to me I had never learned from the words of Jesus. But in the context of his time, I could see how Jesus, or at least the idea of Jesus, was revolutionary. Because Jesus was an example of someone who not only stood against the ignorance of his time, but gave people something positive to reach for beyond it. Spong was helping me reevaluate my Christian experience and extract from it the things that were still important to me. One thing I still sought desperately to understand was prayer in a non-theistic world. Prayer was an experience that I still looked back on as being valuable to me in some way, even though I no longer believed a theistic God had been listening. I read through Spong's chapter on prayer in earnest, trying to learn how prayer could still be meaningful if there was no one there to pray to. Spong's answer was that the way to pray in a world with no theistic God was to connect with the life of the universe itself. For example, he had replaced the time that he had once spent praying with solitary study and reflection. The point was to embrace this life in the eternal now and experience it fully and completely. At first I found his answer disappointing, because it seemed that his answer was basically that there was no way to pray. But eventually I embraced this way of thinking, and changed my focus from trying to find a way to pray to embracing the moment I live in now. One of the most intense focal points of Spong's exposition was finding a new way of understanding God without theism. He saw God as the ground of all being. It was this conception of God that he used to explain the attitudes of Jesus, saying that the example of Jesus called us to be all we could be, living fully, loving wastefully, with no expectation of reward. I found this conception of God as the very grounding of our existence very compelling at the time. It was quite compatible with the stance of pantheism that I had developed at my deconversion and expanded through reading and embracing Jonathan Livingston Seagull. But I was still confused about God, and what exactly, if theism was invalid, God really was. And with this driving curiosity as my impetus, I moved on to a book that was all about God, A History of God, by Karen Armstrong. The God we know, the God of the Western world, the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, has a history. Modern evidence indicates that if you read the Bible as it is currently presented by modern religion, especially if you are reading an English translation, you aren't reading the real story. What you are reading is an edited version of that history, with additions and modifications that present that story in a different way than the evidence indicates it actually happened. According to the Bible, this God has always existed, and this God predated not only human beings, but the universe itself. According to the evidence, this God began evolving from human ideas originating from 14,000 years ago, and didn't become the one God of monotheism until 2,600 years ago, in 600 BCE. If you want to know the story that the evidence presents, the story understood and supported by the majority of religious studies professors, archaeologists, and anthropologists, the place to begin is not the Bible. It is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, which was discovered by archaeologists in the library of Ashurbanipal and dated to have originally been written in about 1750 BCE. As this creation story demonstrates, almost all religions in Mesopotamia at that time were polytheistic. There is no trace of the existence of monotheistic Judaism at this time. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk, champion of the Babylonian gods, defeats chaos in the form of the dragon Tiamat, and then together, the Babylonian gods form the world. In the Babylonian story, The primordial world is described as formless and void. Also in the Babylonian story, light, the firmament, dry land, the sun and moon, and mankind are created in order. These details are important because, as we will see, 1,150 years later, when the Israelites are exiled to Babylon, these details become edited into both the book of Isaiah and the story of Genesis as its first chapter, the first chapter of the entire Hebrew Torah and Christian Bible. Our next point of interest is the Canaanite religion, which archaeologists have reconstructed from clay tablets found in Ugarit, an ancient port city in Syria, and whose stories are dated to have originally been written before 1200 BCE. The Canaanites were also polytheistic. Of the many gods the Canaanites worship, three in particular are important to the rest of the story. They are El Elyon, whose name means literally God Most High, and who is believed to have been the father of the other gods; Asherah, El Elyon's wife; and Baal, who was both god of storms and fertility. The god Yahweh of Israel and the culture of Israel itself still show no signs of existence in the archaeological record. Yet sometime over the next 500 years the culture of Israel must have evolved, because it is at this time, from 950 to 850 BCE, that the contemporaries J and E began writing their independent accounts of the history of the people of Israel, which would later be combined into a single story. Beginning in Genesis chapter 2, none of what J or E writes aligns with the accounts of the Babylonians or Canaanites, whose accounts predated them by hundreds of years. Because of this, and because of the nature of the stories told, the most reasonable inference appears to be that these accounts were entirely mythical stories that the Israelites used to explain the world around them and find meaning in its cultural climate. But that all changes at Genesis chapter 12 with the story of Abraham. It is here that we finally find a connection with the religion of the Canaanites. We can see in the Hebrew version of the Torah that Abraham is said to worship El Shaddai, one of the names for the Canaanite god El Elyon. Abraham interacts with El Elyon in very personal ways that mirror the other pagan religions of the time. For example, in Genesis 18, El Elyon visits Abraham in human form and talks to him in person. His descendant Jacob has similar experiences, where he climbs to the top of a ladder to heaven and talks to El Elyon in a dream. Later, Jacob wrestles with El Elyon. Also from the Hebrew text, we can see that based on these experiences, Jacob makes El Elyon his Elohim, which is a term from the Canaanite religion which meant Jacob was making El Elyon his primary god. The only way that the usage of this term makes sense is if Jacob believed that El Elyon was just one god of many, and that Jacob was committing to this one god in order to receive special protection. In other words, it becomes clear from the terms used in the God they worshipped that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were polytheists or pagans, just like their pagan contemporaries in Canaan and Babylon. The worship of El Elyon fades from the Hebrew text as we enter Exodus, where he is replaced by Yahweh, who is said to have rescued the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt. The story of Exodus, particularly in its modern interpretation in the animated film The Prince of Egypt, depicts ancient Egyptians as the ultimate assholes, viciously enslaving an entire race for the sole purpose of erecting colossal monuments to their own glory. While it is a moving story of triumph and deliverance from oppressive circumstances, on a historical level, it contradicts the modern archaeological evidence that we have for the inner workings of ancient Egyptian culture, particularly their slave ownership practices. Modern archaeological evidence indicates that the workers who built all of the large monuments in Egypt, from pyramids to sphinxes, were well-paid Egyptian citizens who were given good housing, fed well, given good medical care, and given honorable burials. Further, while, like many ancient civilizations, the Egyptians did own some slaves, there is no evidence that they ever owned the magnitude purported by the Bible, or otherwise systematically enslaved an entire race. While the account of Exodus appears to have been largely mythical, its telling nonetheless reveals the polytheistic worldviews of J and E. After the Hebrews are rescued by Yahweh from the Egyptians, we can see even in the English translations of Exodus that they sing, "Who is like you among gods, Yahweh?" and "Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all other gods." Exodus also established Yahweh as Israel's war god, calling him a great warrior who delivered them from Egypt. As the Torah progresses, its polytheistic nature compounds. After arriving in the Promised Land, no longer in need of help in war, but rather desiring to prosper in peace, the Israelites begin to worship once again the Canaanite fertility gods Baal and Asherah. Before reading a history of God, verses like this made no sense to me. In the English translation of the Bible, the Hebrews are presented as choosing between the Lord, Baal, and Asherah. How could the Hebrews be such idiots? Why wouldn't they worship the one God of all creation? The picture looks different when the God you're supposed to be worshiping is Yahweh Sabaoth, which means the God of the armies. Yahweh started as basically the Hebrew version of the Greek god Ares. No wonder he was obsessed with war and death in the Old Testament. That was back when he was still just their god of war. Now the picture made sense. Like the ancient Greeks, the Hebrews had a pantheon of gods they worshipped, or at least the gods Yahweh, Baal, and Asherah. We have archaeological evidence of the polytheistic nature of early Israelite culture in one of our earliest archaeological artifacts from Israel from 1000 BCE, a polytheistic cult stand from Tanakh. Despite their polytheism, there were among the Israelites some with an unusually strong devotion to Yahweh in particular, who are now referred to as Yahwehs. In times of peace, there was little motivation for the people of Israel to give much weight to the opinions of such radical devotees of Yahweh, but times of upheaval accelerated their opinions to the forefront of Hebrew culture. After the death of King Jeroboam II in about 750 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel was in a state of near anarchy. On top of this, it was well known that Assyria wished to capture Israel in its moment of weakness. From this state of upheaval, 3 prophets arose: Isaiah, Amos, and Hosea. All 3 of them cried for devotion to Yahweh and disparaged the worship of other gods. From their prophecies, we can see how each of their versions of Yahweh had been created in their own image. Isaiah, a member of the royal family, had seen Yahweh as a king. Amos, a shepherd, had described his own empathy with the suffering poor to Yahweh. Hosea, who was suffering through marriage problems, saw Yahweh as a jilted husband who still continued to feel a yearning tenderness for his wife, Israel. Ultimately, their outcry did nothing to save the northern tribes, and they fell to Assyria in 711 BCE. But their words lived on in Hebrew scripture and the Hebrew imagination. The cult of Yahweh received another boost during the rule of King Josiah in 622 BCE. Unlike his predecessors, who welcomed an open pagan vision, Josiah was a strict Yahwist. Like the prophets before him, Josiah was convinced that Judah's social problems came from a lack of devotion to Yahweh. During renovations to the temple, Josiah's high priest Hilkiah discovered a lost book of the law, which was alleged to have been authored by Moses. This book was Deuteronomy, and given its conveniently timely discovery, as well as its linguistic features, the majority consensus of biblical scholars such as Richard Elliott Friedman is that it was a forgery. In Deuteronomy, a strict and permanent covenant to Yahweh, as well as a complete rejection of other gods, is established. It is commanded of the Hebrews that they tear down the altars and smash the idols of other gods. In response to the discovery of Deuteronomy, Josiah and his court implemented merciless reforms that officially established Yahweh as the official God of Judah. The reformers also rewrote Israelite history. The historical books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were revised according to the new ideology. And later, the editors of the Pentateuch added passages that gave a Deuteronomist interpretation of the Exodus myth to the older narratives of J and E. The intense hatred of other gods by Yahweh is firmly established in the rewritten Hebrew history. The bloody God Yahweh is made even bloodier, as he is now said to have commanded Joshua to wreak genocide on the natives of Canaan for worshipping other gods. Interestingly, despite the enforcement of this strict devotion to Yahweh, monotheism was still not established. The evidence of Deuteronomist passages like, "You shall have no other gods before me," indicates that even Josiah still believed in the existence of other gods. This was still polytheism. It was just a vicious form of monolaterous polytheism that vehemently rejected the worship of the other gods. But the stage was set. In 604 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar II rose to power in Babylon. It was well known at this time that Nebuchadnezzar sought to conquer Jerusalem. As his armies gathered and prepared, another prophet, Jeremiah, arose, once again crying that strict devotion to Yahweh and the rejection of other gods had been the solution to their problems. Except this new prophet was claiming that it was too late to do anything about it. Yahweh would use this foreign army as his instrument to teach his people a damning lesson. Like the prophets before him, he projected his own emotions, such as fury, onto Yahweh. As Jeremiah predicted, the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon was inevitable. The forces of Babylon were just too massive, and Jerusalem was just in too weakened a state. The temple was destroyed. The Hebrews were exiled from their country to live in Babylon. The Babylonian exile had begun. Their sense of defeat was devastating. Polytheistic gods in ancient Mesopotamia were associated with specific territories of land. When the Hebrews were exiled to Babylon, they felt they could no longer connect with Yahweh. How can we sing the songs of Yahweh while in a foreign land? Ezekiel, a prophet who arose among the exiled Hebrews, expressed how alienated the Hebrews had become. He too blamed their plight on the Hebrew people for a lack of devotion to Yahweh. It was then, at a time when the Hebrew people seemed most crushed, at a time when it seemed certain that the cult of Yahweh would surely die, it instead did something that religion has done throughout history in order to survive. It changed. A new author, who scholars call Second Isaiah, arose, and his words were appended to those of the first Isaiah. I am the first, and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God. Monotheism was born. From this new monotheistic culture, the priestly source P arises. Israelite history is rewritten once again. Exodus is rewritten by P to say that the El Shaddai worshipped by Abraham and the Yahweh worshipped by Moses were the same God. Any references to El Elyon are explained by P as merely different names for Yahweh. The entire book of Leviticus is authored. Genesis 1 is crafted as an improved monotheistic version of the Babylonian account of creation. Second Isaiah rewrites Babylonian myths that were attributed to Marduk, such as his defeat of the dragon Tiamat, attributing them instead to Yahweh. The Torah is rebranded by P to look as if it had always been monotheistic. In 600 BCE, the God of Western monotheism, the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, was born. Once I knew this, my entire perception of the Bible changed once again. Verses that never made sense before made sense now. This was the death blow of monotheism for me. It was the revelation that I could pick up any one of the millions of Bibles in America, from hotel rooms to Christian gift shops, and see its pages dripping with polytheism. I could see, with my own eyes, human beings giving birth to the monotheistic God. As I continued reading about the P generation's contributions to the concept of God, I finally began to see some similarities with the form of theism I had been taught and believed as a Christian. According to P, God was beyond the comprehension of human beings. The full reality of God would always elude our understanding. Rather, only the manifestation of God could be seen, the glory of Yahweh. This conception of the theistic God was further developed by the Greek Jew Philo of Alexandria in 30 BCE. According to Philo, God's essence was unknowable and shrouded in impenetrable mystery. The only way we knew him was through his powers, which he used to interact with our world. God used his powers to communicate with us because our limited intellect could not comprehend his essence. His powers allowed us to catch a glimpse of a reality that is beyond anything we can conceive. I had abandoned even this more mysterious conception of the theistic God for many reasons, which I had solidified after my deconversion, not least of which was because the evidence indicated that this type of theistic God was generated directly from the ideas of polytheism. But it was nice to see a conception of God that was closer to the ground of all being of panentheism, which I now felt was possibly the true form of God. I had encountered a possible expression of the God of panentheism in the Vedic concept of Brahman earlier in the history of God. Brahman was seen as the power that sustains everything. The whole world was the divine activity welling up from the mysterious being of Brahman, which was the inner meaning of all existence. The Vedic Upanishads encouraged people to cultivate a sense of Brahman in all things. Doing so was the unveiling of the hidden ground of all being, and the perception of unity beyond different phenomena. Brahman was not a deity to be thanked or feared by mankind. It was something to be experienced. As I read on, I saw that the Jews themselves began conceptualizing God in very similar ways to Brahman, cultivating God's presence in the smallest details of their daily life. This was the vision of Jews like Rabbi Hillel the Elder in 70 CE. Yet the consistency of these seemingly unified images of God started to break down as I thought about them. What did it mean that God was the ground of all being? Is God the world we see, or something beyond what we see? Did reality emanate from God, or was God reality itself? Was God the creative forces of the universe, or the basic laws upon which those forces were based? Did God live through human beings, or was God a reality outside of human beings? Was God simply everything, or was God something specific that we were seeking after? Was God the grounding that made our actions possible, or was God the energy with which we acted? All of these conceptions of a non-theistic God were different, and they all meant different things. What I was slowly starting to realize, as Armstrong exhibited more and more conceptions of God that had been expressed through the centuries, was that maybe God was just what we called things that we don't understand. Or maybe God was what we called powerful emotions we had. In describing God, perhaps what we were really describing were not things outside of us, but our own psychology, our connection to other people, our sense of wonder about the things in the world that we do understand, our sense of mystery about the things in the world that we don't understand. All these things had been called God, yet they all represented something distinctly different about physical reality. And saying that it is all God, that everything is God, is profound in its own way, but saying that also diminishes the special quality of each individual perspective. Again, perhaps what we were labeling as God was not the things outside of us, but the feelings we have when we experience these things, our own psychology. Even the first century Jews who studied under Rabbi Yohanan seemed to grasp this fact subconsciously. As they developed the concept of God, they stopped doctrinally forcing a specific theology, and instead established theology as a private matter, subjective to each person. But as my introspection had revealed, the concept of God was not only subjective between different individuals, but also subjective within the same individual from moment to moment. In one moment, God meant to me my connection to other people. In another, God meant the awe-inspiring laws of the universe. In yet another, God meant the awe-inspiring expression of the universe itself. Maybe God was not a thing. Maybe God was a feeling. Maybe God was an experience. Maybe God was an expression of our psychology. This was a disconcerting possibility for me to consider at first. Reaching out to some kind of ultimate reality outside of myself had always been an important part of my identity, and still is to this day. At first, I thought that letting go of a belief in a single, unifying quality of reality that could be called God meant letting go of that commitment to reach outside of myself and connect with a greater reality. In fact, letting go of using the word God was something I couldn't accept at first, and I scrambled to somehow make sense of it instead of letting it go. After tolerating a few more chapters of Armstrong's exposition of several more subjective historical iterations of the concept of God, I became frustrated and flipped to the last chapter of the book. What the hell was God in the modern world? I found Armstrong's answer less than satisfying. Her final chapter basically ended with her sorting through the many subjective historical conceptions of God to find the right fit for the modern age. Which God concept could work for us? But how could something that could be selected so subjectively, like we were shopping for the right pair of shoes or a good book to read, be thought of as the ultimate pinnacle of all reality? No. There was a creeping problem with all this reasoning about God. a creeping problem that had started to slowly but steadily crystallize as I read the theological reasoning of people like John Shelby Spong, Karen Armstrong, and religious thinkers throughout history. And that problem was evidence. None of these conceptions of God were motivated by verifiable and binding evidence. And without evidence, we might as well be debating about how many angels could fit on the head of a pin, or the best strategy Frodo Baggins could use to get the ring to Mordor. The theological thought process was contained entirely within our own minds and our own feelings, with no grounding in physical reality. This realization of a lack of grounding in evidence was a problem not only for theism, but for every conception of God, including panentheism and pantheism. If God was just a name that we gave things that we do have evidence for, then using the term God to describe them is meaningless and unhelpful because of the theological baggage the term carries. If we call the natural universe God, we risk implying that it has theistic properties when that isn't what we mean. This was one of Einstein's greatest mistakes as a de facto atheist, one that still annoys atheists today, as theists exuberantly claim him as a believer. But if God is meant to refer to something that is beyond our understanding, like something powerful and intelligent that preceded the universe, or a grounding of our perceived reality that we cannot fully understand, or a universal consciousness that benevolently guides all things, then another problem occurs. By the very nature of these claims, we have no evidence for them. Either way, as I thought about it over the next several months, I could not justify using the term God to describe any aspect of reality any longer. Again, perhaps God was just what we called things that made us feel a certain way. Perhaps ultimately, the best way to think of God was as a feeling we experience, a part of our own psychology. How was it that it was so hard for people to agree on what God was, yet so easy for them to agree that there was a God? Because God is a feeling of the ultimate and the numinous, a feeling that all people share and experience. Not a thing, but a feeling that we use to label our experiences, often the most meaningful experiences of our lives. And a lot of things throughout history had made people have this feeling. So a lot of things throughout history had been called God or called evidence of God. The explanation made a lot of sense. As I continued my journey over the next several years, I began to solidify my currently vague grasp on the principles of evidence and reason that had spontaneously led me to this conclusion. In fact, I began to solidify my grasp on a number of relevant scientific principles as well. Without even realizing what I was doing, I began to embark on a mental boot camp that would transform the way I perceive and think about the world. As I lived my life, as I walked through my busy day, as I entered and exited conversations that made inherent assumptions about how the world works, I found myself with greater and greater frequency beginning to stop and take a moment to consider. How do I know what is real? Why do I believe what I believe? What am I justified to believe? About any situation, about any topic, about the very nature of reality itself. What am I justified to believe? This question is the core concern of a branch of philosophy called epistemology. In 1641, René Descartes attempted to answer this question in a philosophical treatise called Meditations on First Philosophy. He was probably not the first to attempt this, but he is one of the most famous. Descartes begins by presuming that he is not justified to believe anything. He purges himself of all his beliefs. He has multiple reasonable justifications for this first step. One is his observation that there are many opinions he once had when he was younger that he later modified or discarded with age and experience. Another is his observation that, while in a dream, the experience is often indistinguishable from reality. So how is it that he can know that he isn't just in a dream? From here, Descartes tries to justify something, anything, any of his former beliefs. His starting point is the existence of himself. By even questioning if he exists, he justifies belief in his existence. He remarks that, "I am, I exist," is necessarily a true statement every time it is expressed. In later works, he would sum up this argument with the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," or cogito ergo sum. Up to this point, my own conclusions matched precisely with Descartes. While I couldn't justify the existence of my body, or even the existence of the minds of other people, I could at least justify the existence of my own mind by merely contemplating the question of my own existence. But after these first steps, my reasoning parts ways with Descartes in such profound and radical ways that, in order to make my own epistemological reasoning clear, it's probably better that I just express my own judgments and reference Descartes as a possible point of contrast when explaining my own perspective. So, like Descartes, I can reasonably infer that I exist. Now, how do I know that anything outside of myself exists? How do I know that I'm not just experiencing a dream? How do I know that I'm not just a brain in a vat experiencing a computer simulation? How do I know that I myself am not just a program in a computer simulation? The answer is, I don't. I don't know that anything I see or experience is actually real. I have to make a presupposition, an assumption. And that presupposition is, at least some of my perceptions, sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, are accurate, meaning they reflect reality. Not all of them are. I can recall based on experience that all of my senses have been mistaken sometimes. I've thought I saw things I didn't see, like a strange and creepy man who turned out to be a cardboard cutout. I've thought I heard things I didn't hear, like the blood-curdling scream of a woman being murdered that turned out to be the screeches of a bizarre species of owl. I've thought I touched things I didn't touch, like an insect crawling on my face that turned out to be one of my own hairs. But without the presupposition that at least some of my perceptions are accurate, I have nowhere to go epistemologically. Without this presupposition, it is game over. I may be wrong. I may actually be a brain in a vat experiencing simulated illusions, but I have no choice to, at least initially, assume that I am not just a brain in a vat if I want to go anywhere meaningful epistemologically. Presupposing that at least some of my perceptions are accurate, how do I make conclusions about reality? This brings me to my next set of presuppositions. I form beliefs about reality based on physical evidence. The more physical evidence I have for a belief, the more justified I am to believe it. The strength of my beliefs should be directly proportional to the amount of evidence I have for them. If I ever doubt the validity of a conclusion I make based on evidence, I can return to that evidence, re-examine it, and see if I come to the same conclusion. Unlike my previous presupposition, which was weak but necessary, this set of presuppositions has self-reinforcing properties that cause it to have some serious power epistemologically. In fact, unlike Descartes, I will argue that every justified belief that we have about reality is ultimately grounded in evidence. And conversely, that beliefs that are not grounded in evidence, and beliefs that are grounded in less evidence, are unjustified and more weakly justified, respectively. In fact, throughout my explanations, and throughout all of the explanations I have presented in my series so far, I have deferred to evidence-based reasoning to justify my claims. For example, in this video, I'll use visual images and evidential experiences that I presumably share with my viewers to demonstrate my points. In other words, even for the purpose of defending the use of evidence, I have to use evidence. The primacy of evidence to my belief justification process is that inextricable. Descartes makes the argument that some high-level rational beliefs are self-evident. For example, the proposition that 2 plus 3 equals 5 is, Descartes argues, self-evident. But I disagree. Rather, when pressed to do so, we can justify the belief that 2 plus 3 equals 5 using evidence. There are a few ways to do this, and here is one. Count out 5 items. Now place 2 items next to those. Then place 3 items next to those, and see if the 2 piles match. This justifies using visual evidence that 2 plus 3 equals 5. Now I suspect one reason why Descartes was so inclined to declare that 2 plus 3 equals 5 is self-evident was, unconsciously, due to social pressure. There are certain beliefs that are so commonly held by individuals in our society that even questioning them evokes ridicule. In fact, my own awareness of these social pressures made me uncomfortable with the idea of breaking down 2 plus 3 equals 5 into an evidentially based argument. These are beliefs that we are socially pressured to have, through both positive and negative social reinforcement. But the reality is, they are not self-evident, and people who say they are may be unconsciously succumbing to social pressure. It is important to remember that, while the emotional reactions of other human beings are relevant to navigating and nurturing our social climate, they have no bearing on the ultimate truth value or justification of a belief. But there's likely yet another reason that Descartes was inclined to declare 2 plus 3 equals 5 as self-evident, and that is because of presupposition 3b. The more evidence we have for a belief, the more justified we are in believing it. Most of us have been trained in basic arithmetic starting at a young age, and our beliefs about basic arithmetic are reinforced by confirmatory evidence throughout our entire lives as we build and verify arithmetic beliefs. Due to the colossal mountain of evidence that we unconsciously use to support it, the evidential argument for 2 plus 3 equals 5 is so strong that it seems self-evident. But in reality, when we think that, we may be unconsciously making an evidential evaluation of that proposition. The place of evidence in justifying abstract mathematical propositions becomes even more clear as the mathematics becomes more complicated. How do you verify your understanding of a basic principle of algebra? How do you verify that you understand integration by parts? How do you verify that the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees? By working out the problem on paper and possibly verifying your answers through a computer, calculator, or textbook, all of which constitute a form of visual evidence. Evidence is essential to the verification process of even the most abstract and seemingly purely rational principles. And when we separate those rational activities too far from evidential verification, we are prone to make mistaken conclusions that are inconsistent with reality, such as when we try to do too much of a math problem in our head, using the limited cognition available to render visual images in our mind. The primacy of evidence in justifying my beliefs only becomes more concrete as I begin to reason about the physical world. How do I know what grass looks like? How do I know what concrete sounds like when it breaks? How do I know what a pillow feels like? Because of the sensory memories I use as evidence for these properties. And if I ever doubt the conclusions I've made based on these memories, I can always go back and re-experience the evidence for each of them, which is the evidential verification process. This even applies to more complex physical properties. Descartes uses the example of wax as an example of something whose properties we could only know about through our mind and not through our senses. He references a piece of wax he is holding that was freshly taken from a beehive. He points out that it smells like flowers, has a solid form, and it makes noise when struck. Yet when he throws it in the fireplace, it melts. It no longer smells like flowers, it is no longer solid, and it would only burn his fingers, not make noise if struck. Descartes argues that wax has none of the same properties it had before, and yet he still knows it is wax. And so, Descartes argues, it is only through his mind and not through his physical senses that he perceives wax. Yet again, I believe Descartes is unconsciously ignoring the physical evidence he used to come to those conclusions. If Descartes, as a child who had never before seen wax, happened upon both a honeycomb and a melting blob of wax in a fireplace, I very much doubt he would conclude that they were made of the same substance. It is only through the accumulation of physical sensory evidence that Descartes had gathered through the very experience of throwing honeycombs into fires that Descartes could justify his belief that honeycombs turn into melting blobs of wax. Everything we believe about wax and the different forms it can take is justified by the accumulation of physical evidence through physical experience. What about more complicated and difficult to perceive physical phenomena, like wind or radiation? For wind, even though we can't see it, we can feel it, and we can even see the things that it affects. Also, we can measure it through physical devices like anemometers. Physical devices like Geiger counters are particularly relevant to our measurement of radiation, since we can't necessarily feel it. The topic of radiation itself presents an important change in the gradation of the strength of my beliefs. While I have colossal mountains of personal experience to use as evidence for the principles of basic arithmetic and the existence of grass, pillows, and wind, I have not personally, consciously experienced radiation. In fact, how is it that I am aware of the possible existence of radiation at all? This introduces another important set of presuppositions, which can themselves be justified by evidence. It would be infeasible for me to try to personally collect all the evidence I use for my beliefs. I can gather new types of evidence in the form of multimedia, writings, and testimonies given by other people. Because I am not personally experiencing the direct physical evidence that these multimedia, writings, and testimonies represent, I cannot place as much confidence in them as I can in direct physical evidence. With the introduction of these new types of evidence, the world of my evidential reasoning both explodes with new possibilities and becomes more complicated and epistemologically dangerous. If I want to maximize my confidence in a belief, I should only use indirect evidence given to me by other people as a starting point, and then directly verify the physical evidence myself. If I refuse to do this for any belief, I must accept that my confidence in it should be lower than my confidence in a belief based on physical evidence that I have directly verified. Why is it that I'm so skeptical of the conclusions of other people? Why do I place such greater confidence in evidence that I can verify directly? The reason is because of limitations that I recognize in myself. I have frequently and consistently misperceived the details of the physical world. For example, I have frequently misread emails, articles, or comments, only to return to them later and realize my mistaken perception. I have frequently and consistently misremembered what were possibly originally correct perceptions. For example, I have frequently misremembered quotes or physical details of scenes from movies I watched as a child, only to return to them later and realize they weren't as I remembered them. And finally, I have frequently and consistently miscommunicated what were possibly originally correct memories. For example, when explaining algorithms to students in the lab I teach, I sometimes accidentally leave out important details due to the mental resources consumed by the process of explaining. Even in the process of writing the transcript for this video, I've noticed that my ability to explain has improved after allowing myself a night of sleep to free up cognitive resources. As a result, whenever I receive testimonial evidence from other human beings, I am at risk at all times of receiving a miscommunication, of a misremembered misperception. During the process of telling a story or giving a detailed multi-phase explanation, another human being may make multiple errors on all of these different levels. The complication becomes even worse if that human being is depending on a story or multi-phase explanation provided by another human being, and so on. I later discovered cognitive psychology research demonstrating just how common these errors are among human beings, and just how unaware we are that we are routinely making these mistakes every day. The fact that we are unaware of these cognitive mistakes is pivotal to how they are propagated. It means that even when we feel we are being completely honest, and feel that we are being completely coherent, we can still miscommunicate, misremember, and misperceive and possibly never realize we made the mistake. For example, as you are watching this video, it is very likely that you have missed some details about it. For example, because at least some of its content is probably thought-provoking to you, it's likely that sometimes your brain has launched involuntarily into your own personal thoughts, whether you wanted it to or not. When your brain does that, it consumes cognitive resources that you were previously using for attention and perception. And due to the detailed nature of this discussion, it's likely that you either did not perceive or misperceive some details. If you ever go back and watch this video again, it's likely that you will discover that you missed at least some details in the video that you had no memory of after the first viewing. If this is your first time watching the video, you'll likely have this experience even if you feel very confident that you've been following me precisely. I've caught myself experiencing these holes in perception when watching nature documentaries, listening to audiobooks, and even when reading Descartes. It's only because I can rewind these media forms that I can become aware of the details I've missed. Imagine the missing details we could discover if we could rewind our experience of reality. Most of the time, we conduct our lives almost completely oblivious of these misperceptions. Our brains are very adept at filling in holes in our misperceptions to build a story that is so coherent that we rarely recognize the holes are even there. Which, for the sake of smooth cognitive functioning, is probably a good thing. But it is important for us to be aware of these cognitive weaknesses. And recognizing their existence demonstrates the inherent superiority of experiencing direct evidence in comparison to relying on our own memories and the memories of other people. After years of learning and developing my skills at applying these basic principles of evidence-based reasoning, I was in a better position to evaluate the use of more advanced evidential principles such as Occam's razor, as well as examine the relevance of these principles to some of the more contentious claims made in human society throughout human history, especially concerning the existence of God. When I created my first video on evidence, I was operating under the inference that almost all of my viewers had both experienced evidence and had been aware of experiencing evidence from their daily and academic lives that already supported the arguments I was making. And so I inferred that most of the arguments I was making would be pretty uncontroversial. As I discovered from some of the critiques I received in the comment section and video responses, however, I was quite mistaken in that inference. So before moving on to the next part, I'll respond to some of these criticisms and shore up the arguments I made in the first video. Not that this is a bad thing. Responding to these criticisms strengthens the comprehensiveness of the foundations of evidentialism. To begin my epistemological journey, I made two provisional assumptions. I exist, and my senses are sometimes accurate. These provisional assumptions might be wrong. They're just hypotheses. But if I don't assume them, I have nowhere to go epistemologically. I would have no power to infer anything about the world around me. Now, despite this, some people immediately jump ship at this point, saying, "You can't just assume that," which was a response that, at first, I found a bit perplexing. What exactly are these people trying to say? Are they arguing that they don't assume their own existence? Are they arguing that they don't assume their senses are ever accurate? Anyone taking such a stance would be espousing radical skepticism, which is the philosophical position that knowledge is impossible. And this position takes us nowhere. If this is our stance, then it's game over, epistemologically. There's nothing to think and nothing to do because we can believe nothing. Either you make these provisional assumptions with me, or you choose to believe nothing. I don't really see any alternatives. This appears to be a true dichotomy. But there's another, more reasonable concern about these basic assumptions. Some people have argued that if I make these basic assumptions, I can just assume whatever I want. But that isn't true. If I were assuming whatever I want, I would assume I exist, assume my senses are sometimes accurate, Assume the natural world is all there is. Assume there is no God. Assume that abiogenesis did not originate from an intelligence. Assume there was no intelligent design in genetic diversity. Assume all religious experiences are delusions, and so on. Alternatively, I could assume I exist, assume my senses are sometimes accurate, assume there is a supernatural, assume there is a God, assume this God created all life, assume I'm going to an afterlife when I die, assume that God is guiding my life, and so on. But I'm not taking either of those highly presumptive stances. On the contrary, I am assuming as little as possible, just to function in the world, and then letting the evidence tell me the rest. Another criticism was that while I make assumptions, rationalists like Descartes don't make assumptions. Rationalists are just observing a priori truths. To which my response is, how can you know a priori whether something is a truth? To which a common answer is, you can know a set of statements are true if they are internally consistent. Well, first, that is an assumption. But let's entertain this principle and see how well it holds up. This type of epistemology is called coherentism. Namely, beliefs are true if they are members of a coherent set of beliefs which both support and don't contradict each other. The beliefs are internally consistent. Though coherentism has problems that can be illuminated right out of the gate. Take 3 different religions: Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism. All 3 of these religions can be formulated in a way that they are internally consistent. But clearly, they all contradict each other. Therefore, they can't all be true. Therefore, internal consistency among a set of beliefs is not sufficient for truth. This is called the isolation objection to coherentism. Namely, a set of beliefs can be internally consistent in isolation without actually being true. And at least 2, if not all of these religions must be false, since they can't all be true. Now, while internal consistency is not a sufficient condition for an epistemology, it does appear to be a necessary condition. And the argument of evidentialism is that it is coherent because the physical universe itself is coherent. This is not just an assumption. This is an evidence-based argument. It can be built off of evidence-based sub-arguments, such as the fact that multiple independently manufactured temperature gauges will all report the same temperature in the same geographical location at the same time within a given error range. So the claim of internal consistency doesn't rescue rationalists from the fact that they are making at least some assumptions, just like me. No matter how much you may try to squirm out of it by euphemistically labeling your assumption as self-evident or as an a priori truth, the reality is you are making an assumption. And it is more dangerous to unconsciously make an assumption but confidently label it as a truth than it is to consciously make an assumption and humbly be prepared to discover that it isn't true. Another very common objection to evidentialism is that it is self-refuting. Namely, if I say, only beliefs that are justified by evidence are valid, that claim itself is not supported by evidence. In my previous video, my implicit answer to this supposed refutation was that every belief except these 5 provisional assumptions or hypotheses needs to be justified by evidence, which is a pretty good answer, because it's not like the first 2 hypotheses are shielded from themselves either. For example, if you say, I think, therefore I am, your statement itself assumes the existence of an I who can think. And if you say, my senses are sometimes correct, how are you going to prove that? With your senses? Therefore, again, these first 5 can just be taken as provisional hypotheses that are open to future refutation or revision. But I can do better than that. Let's take another approach so I can quell any possible objections that evidentialism is self-refuting. Most rationalists, even Descartes, do believe that physical evidence is a valid way of justifying beliefs. So let's scrap that third set of hypotheses and add this as a provisional assumption that we all share. Using this shared assumption, the thesis of evidentialism is that all beliefs are justified by physical evidence. This is no longer a simple assumption. We are upgrading this to a full-fledged, large-scale, evidence-based argument. And as I just said, that's okay, because even rationalists agree that physical evidence is a valid form of justification. So what is the evidence for this argument? Well, it contains many sub-arguments, and my series serves as one of the many platforms that presents sub-arguments to support it. And I will present further evidence for this thesis now. One of the criticisms leveled at the thesis of evidentialism by many atheists was that some beliefs are true, but not based on physical evidence. One of the most common examples was mathematics. Math, they claim, is a purely rational activity. It has no basis in evidence. Mathematics is based on proofs, and proofs are purely rational. Let's examine this claim. The generally accepted basis for all of mathematics is set theory. For example, Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. Set theory discusses sets, which are well-defined collections of objects. But where does the idea of sets itself come from? I think the evidence indicates that the origin of the idea of sets is pretty clearly the physical universe. Without a physical universe containing collections of discrete objects, how would we abstract the idea of sets? Imagine we lived in a universe where there were no discrete objects, where all things oozed and melded into each other. How would we ever abstract the idea of sets in such a universe? Or imagine that our brains were initialized into a blank empty space. How would we ever abstract the idea of sets if there was nothing to collect? From sets, we can abstract the idea of numbers, which are labelings of specific set sizes. From numbers, we can abstract the idea of addition, which is the combination of subsets. Subtraction, which is the removal of subsets. Multiplication, which is the duplication of a single set a specific number of times to form a superset. Division, which is the uniform distribution of a single set into a specific number of subsets. Squares, which are the multiplication of a number times itself. Square roots, which are the inverse of this operation. Infinity, which is the abstraction of imagining what would happen if we started adding and never stopped. Negative numbers, which are an abstraction from positive numbers by imagining they stretched into infinity in the opposite direction. And because when two square roots of the same number are multiplied, they reproduce that number, we can then abstract to the idea of an imaginary number, the square root of -1. Abstractions of abstractions of abstractions. This is what mathematics is. And the abstractions of mathematics are only possible because we live in a universe of discrete physical objects which can be grouped into sets. Without those objects, we never would have had anything to abstract from. Over time, we've had to formalize our abstractions based on other abstractions because of paradoxes we discovered in still other abstractions. This has caused us to periodically return to our mathematical foundations and modify them. But I think that the basic ideas of mathematics pretty clearly derive ultimately by abstracting from physical evidence. And this has proven very fruitful for us as a species when isomorphisms between our abstractions and the physical universe allow us to return to the physical universe and apply our abstractions to engineering applications. But what about logic? Logic isn't based on evidence, is it? And mathematics is based on logic. On the contrary, I think it is pretty clear that logic also is ultimately just an abstraction of physical experience based on physical evidence. Let's take modus ponens, for example. If A, then B. A, therefore B. This is so abstract. How could this possibly be based on physical experience? The answer? The evidence of physical causation. If it rains, I get wet. If I touch fire, I get burned. If I drop this glass, I will break it. A little reflection reveals just how ubiquitous this concept is in physical experience, and just how easily we could abstract it from physical evidence. This is strong evidence that the concept of modus ponens is just an abstraction of physical experience. I think the extreme irony of this situation is that we have experienced so much evidence for these abstractions that we no longer need evidence to remember and apply them. And so we find ourselves under the illusion that they are self-evident. But if you ever need a reminder that these statements are not self-evident, just walk into a kindergarten classroom and start spouting them as self-evident truths and expect the children to remember and understand them. You will likely be reminded very quickly that these are not self-evident truths. They are abstractions based on physical evidence. And if you want people who have not yet experienced the evidence for these abstractions to comprehend, remember, and believe them, you must present the evidence for them. This understanding of abstraction centers around the fact that we have an embodied mind, a mind that exists within a body. One of the most visible proponents of the embodied mind argument is George Lakoff, a cognitive linguist. He and Rafael Nunez present arguments similar to mine in the book Where Mathematics Comes From, How the Embodied Mind Brings Mathematics into Being. It is held by embodied mind proponents that mathematics and logic do not actually exist in any real sense other than in human brains. Rather, we construct mathematics and logic by abstracting from the embodied experiences that we have. In other words, from the physical evidence we experience. I think this argument has profound implications for the teaching of abstract disciplines like mathematics, because teachers with a rationalist approach will likely focus on memorizing abstract mathematical truths as if they are self-evident. But teachers with an evidentialist approach will focus on presenting examples that justify the abstractions. The evidentialist will present both the abstraction and the evidence it is based on. The rationalist will only present the abstraction, missing half of the argument, and in my experience, confusing students and obfuscating the learning process. Another failed approach is presenting the examples without the abstraction. A lot of my ire towards rationalism stems precisely from being subjected to rationalist teaching approaches as a student in a highly mathematical discipline. It also stems from being a teacher in that discipline, and witnessing other teaching assistants confuse the hell out of their students with rationalist approaches and then complain because their students just weren't getting it. Based on what I've seen from cognitive psychology, the learning process is extremely evidence-based, where good teachers present abstractions and explain the evidence needed to support them, or present the evidence and explain the abstractions that can be drawn from it. This is related to the formation of semantic and episodic memories, which I'll explain later in the series. In fact, I suspect that evidentialism will win this argument precisely because it's the actual basis of human learning and rationalism isn't, and therefore, rationalism, in trying to defend itself as an epistemology, will likely always come across as more muddled and confused to an audience than evidentialism will. I think rationalism stems from a kind of laziness about abstractions, leaving the job of justification half done, and simply labeling some of the abstractions as a priori truths or self-evident, whereas an evidentialist will take the time to try to investigate and explain where all of our abstractions come from, or at least have the intellectual honesty to admit when the job of justification isn't yet finished. But that's enough criticism of rationalism for now. Let's move on to my final note on what evidentialism is not. A final complaint from many people was that this is just logical positivism. First, no, it isn't. Evidentialism is its own position with its own publications, its own principles, and its own arguments. Second, that's not an argument. If you believe that there is something wrong with either evidentialism or logical positivism, it is your responsibility to make at least a brief argument for what that problem is. A mere appeal to convention is not sufficient. With these critiques addressed, I think this is a sufficient amount of defense for evidentialism to justify moving on. If you would like to present an alternative epistemology that you think better explains justification, you're free to do so. Feel free to attach it as a video response. But I think I've sufficiently justified evidentialism to the point that we can talk about what happens when we apply evidentialism to the hypothesis of God.